I can't remember English vocabulary. Have you ever thought this or even said it to someone out loud that you can remember your English vocabulary when you're studying it, but when you get in a conversation, somehow those words are just gone? Today, I'm going to tell you how you can learn and remember English vocabulary in a better way so that you can build vocabulary and become more fluent in English. Welcome to English Coach 3Ts. If we haven't met, my name is Tanya. Let me tell you how you're going to learn vocabulary so that you can remember it. And the way you do that is with a story. The story I have for you today is about the wildfires that we have here in Southern California, and some of the things that are interesting and maybe not so great about that particular subject. So, how will this help you to learn more vocabulary, but even more importantly, remember it? Using stories that you understand most of. Maybe you don't understand all of the story, but you understand most of the story, helps your brain to remember vocabulary and also build that vocabulary. If this is new to you, I'm going to talk about it more when I get to the end of this video. But first, I'm going to tell you the story so you can start learning now. So, I've lived here in Southern California off and on for over 30 years, and wildfires have always been a problem. But in the more recent years, this problem has gotten worse and worse, as you may have heard on the news, worldwide. And so I thought that it might be interesting to hear a little bit of the experience from someone who lives here in Southern California, has experienced some of these wildfires, and knows other people who have actually lost their homes to the fire. I first moved to Southern California when I was about 21 years old and lived in and around San Diego. And at that time, I was almost completely oblivious to the wildfires, meaning that I never thought of it, I never heard about it, I didn't even really know that it was a problem. But when I moved back to Southern California in the mountains near Los Angeles, I started to learn that the wildfires are not unusual. And at that time, especially in the summer, when it is very, very hot, the wildfire season has kind of been thought to be in the very hottest part of summer, when the climate is very dry and there's almost no humidity, no rain. And of course, that makes for the perfect type of environment for a fire to start. So the season was thought to be from like June through August, give or take, meaning approximately. Even though the wildfire season here in Southern California was only for this short amount of time, sadly, now it's wildfire season all year long. You may have heard about the huge fires in Los Angeles just a couple of months ago. And this is proof of how these wildfires have just become more and more dangerous. So what causes these fires? Sadly, the top two reasons for these wildfires includes arson. Arson is when someone purposely starts the fire, or you could say sets the fire. For me, this is one of the saddest parts of the California wildfires, is that arson is in the top two reasons we have these wildfires. The other reason in the top two is power lines. Power lines are those wires you see when you're driving along a road that bring electricity and that kind of thing to everyone's home. And I can tell you that one of the things I deal with regularly as someone who lives here in the mountains. Often during the worst parts of fire season and during the windiest parts of the year, we have our electricity turned off, or we would say our electricity is out. They turn off the electricity so that when the winds are blowing, if a tree falls or even a branch or something falls, it doesn't start a fire. And during the Los Angeles fires just recently, there were more times than usual that the electricity was turned off here in my community, and especially in the community just 5 minutes from me, had their electricity turned off for most of 2 weeks. You heard us talk just a little about these wildfires in my video where I interviewed Shauna from American English Podcast. If you'd like to see that interview with another native speaker, I'll link it here and below in the description. She tells some very interesting stories, not only about the wildfires in Los Angeles, but also her experience with hurricanes where she lives now in North Carolina. And everybody would be aware, they would be prepared, and they would know that there's a chance that you could be evacuated, or in other words, asked to leave your home because the situation was so dangerous that the firefighters thought it's not safe for people to stay at their home. That's exactly what happened to me and my family in the late 90s. We were living here in this little village in the mountains, and the entire village of about 3,000 people, including people who live near the village, was evacuated. We were told we had a few hours to get the most important things from our homes and to go somewhere to be safe. The problem is, this time I was not on the mountain, I was off the mountain doing some shopping in a nearby town. But I got the news that we had been evacuated and found out that I needed to come back to my house as quickly as possible, get the things that were important to me, and get off the mountain. This was before cell phones, so it was a completely different experience from the standpoint that I couldn't just call friends and family like I might be able to do today. So I quickly drove to try and drive back up the mountain, but I was stopped at a roadblock. Oftentimes, police or people who are in the safety industry, like firefighters, will put up a roadblock where they have signs and things that keep people from driving through. And in this case, it was a roadblock that you could only go up on the mountain if you lived there. Actually, that was a different time for snow. Sometimes when it snowed, we would also have a roadblock. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it, they weren't letting anyone back up on the mountain because it was too dangerous, and they were telling everyone to leave anyway. This would have been something very difficult for me if I was just going to lose my home and the things in my home, including things that were not replaceable. But on top of all of that, my 2 dogs at the time were in the house, and I was very upset that these 2 dogs would be caught in the house and the house would catch on fire and they would be very badly injured or even killed. So I went and found a payphone. Back in those days, we had payphones where you could pay to make a call. And I called friends and asked them to let my dogs out of the house and let them go. Let them be free. Of course, this was not something I wanted to do because you don't want to just let your dogs free in the forest. That can also be very dangerous, as there are wild animals like coyotes and mountain lions, bobcats that again could either injure the dogs very badly, or even kill them. But I figured they had a better chance of surviving. When I say I figured they had a better chance of surviving, I mean, I thought that was probably the best chance that they had. You may have heard me talk about these dogs before, at least Diogi. Diogi and Pepper were my dogs at that time, and I've talked about them in another story about hiking. I think it might have just been Diogi. Either way, I'll put a link above and below so that you can watch that story about Diogi as well. Gratefully, we tried to drive around the mountain to another way to go up the other side of the mountain. There are basically 3 ways to go up this mountain and only 2 ways to get into the town once you get further up the mountain. When we drove around to the other side of the mountain, just to give it a try, they allowed us to drive up the mountain. So we got home, and even though our dogs had been let free by a friend, we were able to get our dogs, some of the important paperwork we had, some family photos, the kinds of things that you can't replace, put them all in the car and drive down off the mountain. For that evacuation, we stayed in a hotel in a town that is about 45 minutes from where we live. And if I remember correctly, we stayed there 3 or 4 days before they let us come back up the mountain. I think one of the interesting things about the evacuations that I have been a part of or I have heard of is that there are some people who exercise their right to say no. In other words, they have the right to say no, and by exercising that right, they say no. I don't want to leave my home. I know it's dangerous. And then the authority, the firefighters, I hear a siren now, they will say, okay, you've been warned, you can say no, but if something happens, you are also responsible for your own life and your own property. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs about that, meaning I don't know all the details about how that works because I chose to leave when they said that it is no longer safe. But I know there were people who stayed, and the interesting thing is you could talk to the people who stayed and hear stories about what it was like to be in this little town with no people, almost like a ghost town. We call a town a ghost town when no one lives there anymore. And there are a lot of ghost towns in the United States, like Jerome, Arizona, and Bisbee, Arizona, where people have moved back. They were towns where there was maybe mining or something where a lot of people lived during a time when there was a lot of industry or a lot of ways to make income there. And then when that income went away, the people also went away and the town became kind of dead. It was a ghost town. But it's become popular here in the United States to revive those ghost towns, or in other words, to come back and make tourist attractions out of them, or even just to live there. And this town, although it wasn't actually a ghost town, was like a ghost town because everyone was gone except for just a few people and the firefighters and whatever other emergency professionals were here. I know that it was true for me as I was leaving, and became even more true as time went by, that there were ashes falling from the sky. Ash is the material that's very lightweight. When you burn wood, what's left over is called the ash. And because the forest was burning, the wind was blowing the ash and it was coming down from the sky, which is a very eerie feeling. Eerie meaning kind of strange and scary at the same time. And I still can barely imagine deciding to stay in a situation like that. How about you? Would you go to wherever they say is safe, or would you stay in your home and wait it out, meaning to wait and see what happens next? As I said a little bit ago, a few days later, the evacuation was lifted. In other words, they said, you can come back to your home now, and the town had been saved. A lot of the forest around the town was black from being burnt, but the town itself was saved. And this particular time that I'm thinking of was right before the 4th of July. And our small town often has a really awesome 4th of July parade where people who live in the town will be in the parade. They will make things on their cars or their trailers or whatever, and they come down Main Street. I think I've maybe had videos of this on my Instagram. There's horses and children and people from different clubs and all kinds of things. But this year, because we were all off of the mountain, no one had made the plans and did all of the things that needed to be done for the parade. So instead of that kind of parade, instead, all of the firefighters from all the different towns and even different states drove their fire engines and ambulances and police cars down the main street of my town. And I just remember it was such an emotional experience to be at this parade where lots of people held up signs that said, "Thank you for saving our town." And each of the fire vehicles that went by had signs telling what city or state they were from. And I was crying. Other people were crying. It was so emotional to share this experience on the 4th of July, which you may know is Independence Day here in the United States. Now, there are other stories that I could tell you about evacuations in my town, but I'm going to stick with this one so that you have the opportunity to really understand all of the things I was saying in this story. I want to tell you a couple of ways you can use this story to improve your vocabulary, and I want to tell you how it works. So, one of the things you can do is to join my free More English Club, where I send out a practice plan for each of my videos that is free. It doesn't cost anything to join this club, and I will make sure the link is in the description below. When you send me your name and email address, I'll send you the free practice plan, and you'll get the practice plans from some of the videos in the past. On that plan, I will tell you ways that you can practice using some of the vocabulary that I talked about in this story today. But another thing you can do while you're waiting for that practice plan to come in your email is to just think to yourself, how much did I understand? I don't mean how many words did you understand? I mean, could you understand about 95% of the story? If the answer is yes, then wait for the practice plan and do the practice things I tell you there. If you understood less than 95%, then I recommend you go back and listen to the story part again. Maybe slowly, maybe you listen to a little bit and pause it and listen to a little bit more. But don't slow down the speed of me speaking. Instead, try to catch the words I say as I say them. Usually, when you listen to a story again, you can understand a lot more. I know that is my experience in learning Spanish. If I listen to something the first time and I don't understand, because I understood parts, when I go back and listen again, I start to understand some of the parts I didn't understand before. How does this work? Why does this make it easier to remember words? Well, there's a lot to learn about that, but basically it's about the theory of comprehensible input. You may have heard me talk about this before, but if not, I'll be sure to put a video above and below for a little more information on comprehensible input. And even if you know a little bit about comprehensible input, I recommend that you do a search, in English of course, to learn more about this. What happens when you are using comprehensible input is that you understand 95%, and so your brain is listening to that 95% that you do understand, and it's remembering those words and phrases and grammar, and it's becoming easier and easier for your brain to remember those things that it already understands because of the repetition. But this is a different repetition than we learned in school. It's the type of repetition that actually works for your brain. And because it's becoming easier and easier to remember those words, your brain, in a way, has room to remember new words. And because of that, you begin to remember more and more of the things you need to know to become more fluent. Now, I know there are quite a few new vocabulary words in this story, and there maybe are a lot that you already know. But if you want to listen to even more stories so that you can get the comprehensible input you need, be sure to go and watch this story next, and I'll see you there.